Hi everyone, this is Adina and this is my Menopause channel. I read all the research, so you don't have to. Today I'm holding this mic because after putting this outfit on I realized I have nowhere to clip it except, I don't know, I was thinking like on my nipple, but that would be kind of, I don't know, weird, and maybe it wouldn't even work. It's a learning curve. Today I'm going to do the second part of my video Advanced HRT, focusing on cycling hormone replacement therapy and why I'm doing it, which is the benefits of unopposed estrogen. Unopposed estrogen simply means in this context estrogen without progesterone. And how I found out about the benefits of unopposed estrogen is another story. So it's story time again. So after I got my much needed prescription for HRT, that is hormone replacement therapy, and I started using it, there was a brief honeymoon period when I was so happy everything was going so well, but then I started experiencing some other problems which were not as serious as the menopausal symptoms that went away with this treatment, but they were pretty troubling. These problems were intermittent bleeding and spotting and breast tenderness. Of these, it was the bleeding that caused me the biggest headache because every time it happened, I called my gynecologist because you're told that if you're experiencing bleeding, you have to call, and like a good girl, I did. And I went in, he called me in for a vaginal ultrasound to measure the thickness of my endometrium. And this is the protocol every time a woman past menopause experiences bleeding, because it needs to be investigated to make sure that it's not uterine cancer. And the reason is that any type of bleeding in menopause can be a sign of uterine cancer. What they do is they measure the thickness of the uterine lining. How about that thickness? For women in their reproductive years, the thickness of the uterine lining can range from 1 millimeter to 16 millimeters based on what day of the cycle we're on. And that's because estrogen builds up the lining in preparation for a pregnancy. And then if fertilization doesn't occur and the egg in waiting dies, all the hormones plummet, and we basically shed that endometrium, we bleed it out, and then the process starts all over again. So at its thickest, it is 60 millimeter for women in their reproductive years. For women in menopause, if the thickness is above 5 millimeters, it's considered abnormal and warrants further investigation. What they mean by further investigation is an endometrial biopsy. During this, what they do is they shove a rod up your hoo-ha, ram it through your cervix, and take just a little snippet of that lining as a sample. All of this, of course, without any anesthesia whatsoever. This time, my uterine lining thickness came back at 11 millimeters. Which requires this lovely further investigation. The doctors will tell you that this is no big deal, but I was hanging around long enough on hormone replacement forums to know that this is extremely painful. And a lot of women say they almost passed out when they did this to them. Even I remember that when I was in my 20s, I got an IUD placed, and it was a very similar process in that they put something up your cervix, and I almost passed out from the pain. So I just hopped off the table and I said, well, I have somewhere to go. Can we schedule this for next week? And he said, all right, fine, call us to schedule it. And then I went home and I started thinking. Remember in the previous video, I mentioned how when I entered this hell called menopause, I became obsessed with research. I was researching nonstop, like no kidding. I still have this enormous collection of bookmarks through which I can trace my steps back on how I came upon cycling HRT. When I came back from the doctor, I started researching again. I wanted to avoid a biopsy if possible, but I also didn't want to be careless with my health. I mean, the lining was thick and I needed to get it thinned out. So I went on some of these hormone replacement forums where some of the ladies suggested that doubling up on progesterone could help, that would thin out the lining, but that would probably take 2 to 3 months. Thinking about it logically, I thought a quicker way to achieve the same result could be just to have a period. After all, that's what happened in our reproductive years, i.e., we built up the lining preparing for a pregnancy. Then, if fertilization didn't occur, our hormones plummeted and we bled out the lining within a few days. I chose this alternative, also known as a forced shed. I stopped all the hormones, and indeed, within a few days, I started bleeding. It was kind of like a period because I felt crampy and moody, but it was still better than the biopsy, I thought. I was actually starting to feel nostalgic, like, oh my, I have a period again. It was strange. And it worked. After the bleeding stopped, I went back to my gynecologist and I asked him to do another vaginal ultrasound to check the lining of my uterus, and it came back at 3 millimeters. Yay! And at that point, he agreed that it wasn't necessary to do the biopsy. So I went back on the hormones, but after 3 months, the same thing started happening all over again. The spotting. And I went back to the gynecologist and he measured my lining again. It was thick again. And I begged him to wait and not to do the biopsy. And I could tell that he was getting pretty frustrated with me. And, there's always this fear in the back of your head that they're going to yank your hormone prescription from you.
No more hormones for you.
Basically, he concluded that my uterus is so sensitive to estrogen that even at the first few drops of it, it starts prepping for pregnancy. And one way to resolve this is to get an ablation. What is an ablation? This is another lovely procedure in which they destroy the lining of the womb, either by heat, like heated fluids, or they burn it off with radio frequency, with a laser, or an electric current, or they freeze it off. All of this, of course, with minimal anesthesia. I had misgivings about this procedure, and not just because of the pain, but I just don't think it's a good solution to take something away from my body. And truly the biggest problem with this procedure is that one of the functions of the endometrium is to signal uterine health. That is, when you start bleeding, that means something is wrong. So if you have an ablation, you could miss the early warning signs of uterine cancer. So I came to the conclusion that if I wanted to stay on HRT, I would need to regularly schedule a forced shed. And this is how I ended up learning about cycling HRT, which is basically inducing the bleeding to clear the lining at specific intervals, be it monthly, 2 monthly, or quarterly. As I was doing more research on cycling HRT to decide what method and what length I would use, I came up on a couple of interesting articles written by a professor who actually works at my alma mater, the University of Southern California. He runs an Alzheimer's lab in the School of Medicine there. And he did a bunch of experiments to see how the two female sex hormones, estrogen and progesterone, impact the progression of this disease. Alzheimer's is a nasty disease that I think we all fear, and it's caused by the accumulation of plaques called beta amyloid. These are sticky peptides that disrupt neuron function and lead to cognitive decline. They also get entangled with other proteins, especially one called tau, which is a molecule that stabilizes the microtubules of neurons, which are the railways of neurons. If this molecule clumps together with beta amyloid, that is known as tau hyperphosphorylation, then it's really game over. That's the hallmark of Alzheimer's, because the neurons can't communicate normally anymore. By then, I already knew, like most people who are into HRT, that hormones have some really important neuroprotective effects. And this extends to mitigating the risk of neurodegenerative diseases such as Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and dementia. An important study that documented this was written in 2021 with the title Association Between Menopausal Hormone Therapy and Risk of Neurodegenerative Diseases, Implications for Precision Hormone Therapy. The researchers analyzed the 10-year health insurance claim records of women over 45 and found that women who underwent menopausal hormone replacement therapy for 6 years or greater were 79% less likely to develop Alzheimer's and 77% less likely to develop any neurodegenerative disease. And it's important to underscore that this shows evidence for success of prevention of such diseases with HRT and not their treatment. So I was very intrigued when I read that this professor was investigating the mechanism of this protective effect. And he was trying to tease out if estrogen and progesterone had different roles in maintaining brain health. And he came to the conclusion that cycling HRT is superior in preventing neurodegenerative diseases. How did he arrive at that conclusion? In the first study, his team used mice, which were made to be genetically disposed to Alzheimer's. Some got estrogen, some got progesterone, some got both, and then there was a control group which got none. He examined their behavior, but he also looked at the brains of the mice to follow the accumulation of those harmful proteins. And he found that progesterone actually blocked some of the neuroprotective effects of estrogen, but enhanced others. Specifically, progesterone inhibited estrogen's effect of lowering the beta amyloid plaques. On the other hand, adding progesterone to estrogen significantly decreased the amount of tau plaques. Another study by another team also concluded that progesterone alone doesn't do much for cognitive health. Estrogen by itself does the most. But according to the USC study, you also need to add progesterone to estrogen in order to experience estrogen's additional neuroprotective effects. The same doctor did a follow-up study in which he tested the effects of cyclic progesterone on the brains of mice. Cyclic here means intermittently administered, meaning you only give progesterone in a limited amount of time. And this article is called Continuous and Cyclic Progesterone Differentially Interact with Estradiol in the Regulation of Alzheimer-Like Pathology in Female 3 times transgenic Alzheimer's disease mice. In this experiment, they subjected the mice to the same type of cyclic HRT that I was talking about in the previous video. In other words, they administered estrogen alone for some time, and then they added progesterone. And he compared the brain health of these mice to the control group, which was on the static type of HRT, meaning they got estrogen and progesterone all the time. And he found the following. All groups with estrogen and or progesterone treatments showed significant reduction in anxiety-related behaviors, but improvement attained from progesterone plateaued at levels achieved after only 10 days of progesterone use. So no matter how long the progesterone was used, whether it was by itself or in combination with estrogen, After 10 days, it didn't get better results with more days of use. Also, continuous progesterone inhibited the plaque-lowering action of estrogen, whereas cycling progesterone did not. Continuous progesterone also inhibited estrogen's beneficial effect on working memory. Cyclic progesterone amplified it. Working memory, or lack thereof, is all about the menopausal brain fog we often talk about. Both continuous, coupled with estrogen, and cyclic progesterone lower the tau hyperphosphorylation. To sum it up, according to these studies, you need unopposed estrogen to get its full neuroprotective benefits. And progesterone works in tandem with estrogen to exert a different type of neuroprotective benefit that estrogen has by itself. However, the benefit of progesterone coupled with estrogen is maximized at 10 days of use at a time, and nothing more is gained by extending the progesterone administration past those 10 days. And now I need to go back to this chart to say how amazing nature is, that it exposes women to both estrogen alone in the first half of the cycle and then couples it with progesterone for about 10 days. Isn't that coincidental? To experience the maximum neuroprotective benefit of estrogen. The only side problem is, of course, that nature stops doing this for us when we go through the change. And that's really unfair because we still have shit to do after we pushed out a couple of babies. And I feel that evolution messed up in this regard, but maybe it will correct itself, or better yet, maybe we will correct it. As I said in the beginning, what started me on this quest was that I kept spotting and bleeding on hormone replacement, and I figured that I needed to do a regular forced shed to clear out my lining. But when I read these studies on the different neuroprotective effects of estrogen and progesterone, it really sold me on the idea of cycling hormone replacement. I think that dementia and cognitive decline is one of the scariest prospects that we as women face, especially because Alzheimer's is twice as prevalent in women as in men, and there's no cure for it. I personally am not 100% convinced about estrogen increasing the risk of breast cancer, but if I have to roll the dice, I would rather get breast cancer than dementia, because with breast cancer, at least there's a chance for treatment and for a cure, but with dementia, there is none. And you can certainly have a breast implant, but you can't have a brain implant. At least not yet. That's it for today's video. For the next couple of videos, I would like to focus more on perimenopause and what are some of the symptoms that may be interpreted as some disease, whereas they're actually perimenopause. Until then, subscribe to survive.